Farmer Oliver Harding, upon discovering a warped old barn, suddenly finds himself on the brink of his family's greatest secret. A crack in the floor reveals an ancient underground complex brimming with strange, inexplicable energy. Pulsating columns and flickering symbols hint at an unknown, possibly supernatural technology. Electronic malfunctions and an intensifying hum create the sense that the very space is fending off unwelcome visitors. Mysterious noises and visions make Oliver question just how safe the secrets buried beneath his land really are. His longtime friend Mason, an experienced surveyor unafraid of the unknown, steps in to help. Together, they witness incredible surges of power, suggesting the possible awakening of ancient forces. Groaning walls and ever-shifting patterns confirm that this subterranean structure seems almost alive. Torn between the farm's financial salvation and the danger of attracting unwanted attention, Oliver and Mason must make a difficult choice. The raging storm overhead, the eerie glow below, and a growing sense that past and future converge right here and now are only the beginning of a grand adventure. The damp wind swept across the rolling fields of Talac Ridge, a secluded stretch of farmland in northern Vermont, where the vastness of sky met the silent watch of distant mountains. Mist clung to the tall grass in a way that gave each blade a ghostly aura, and the swollen clouds overhead appeared ready to burst at any moment. The farm itself had belonged to the Harding family for 3 generations, ever since Oliver Harding's grandfather first set foot on this land with little more than a few cattle and a dream. Oliver was a man shaped by the earth, broad-shouldered, sun-beaten, and possessed of an unwavering work ethic. But beneath the hard-working exterior, he harbored a quiet longing for something beyond the daily grind of chores and seasonal changes. He had intended to spend this particular morning repairing fences damaged by the previous night's squall. The winds had howled through the valley, rattling every loose board on the property and toppling the older branches that had precariously hung overhead for years. Yet, when Oliver left his farmhouse at dawn, he immediately noticed that part of the wide clapboard barn behind the main field looked oddly tilted, as if the storm had shoved it off its foundation. He wasn't surprised, the structure was long overdue for significant repairs he could never quite afford, but the degree to which it had shifted raised alarm. Nervously, he approached the barn, half expecting it to collapse at the slightest touch of his boot against the rotting planks. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges. As soon as he entered, the musty smell of damp hay and decaying wood welcomed him with a pungent greeting. Weak morning light filtered through the cracks in the roof, illuminating swirling dust motes that danced in the beams. At first, Oliver just circled around, muttering to himself about the cost of repairs, stepping gingerly to avoid the places where the floorboards sagged. Then he saw something that made him pause, a gaping hole in the floor near the far corner, where a stack of old crates once stood. The crates had spilled their contents of rusted tools across the ground, revealing a sharp drop beneath the barn. He'd never been aware of any sort of root cellar or storm shelter beneath this building, certainly not in that particular spot. He crouched and peered over the jagged edge of broken boards into a dark space below. It didn't look like any typical cellar. Even from above, he could tell the walls were smooth stone, not the rough, hand-laid foundations common in old Vermont barns. A strange chill radiated from the darkness. Oliver felt it immediately, a gentle coolness that contrasted sharply with the humid summer air. Something about it made his scalp prickle with uneasy excitement, the same kind of feeling he remembered experiencing as a child when he thought he'd found a secret room in his grandfather's attic. Back then, it had turned out to be a simple storage nook. This time, it was immediately clear that he had stumbled upon something far more unusual. Deciding to investigate, Oliver found a few intact boards and hammered them into place around the opening to create a makeshift perimeter. Then he fetched an old ladder from behind the barn. He tested its rungs with a firm stomp, they seemed sturdy enough to hold his weight. With a mixture of trepidation and curiosity, he placed the ladder down into the hole. Its base hit the stone surface below with a sharp clack that echoed strangely. He took one final glance at the sunlight streaming in through the ragged hole in the barn floor, then descended into the darkness. As soon as his boots touched stone, a barely perceptible hum seemed to vibrate through the air, almost like the distant resonance of a tuning fork. Oliver stood still for several seconds, letting his eyes adjust. The beam of his flashlight carved a path through swirling dust, revealing walls made of what appeared to be polished granite. No mortar lines broke the smooth surface. It was as though each wall had been carved from a single solid slab. Tiny flecks in the stone reflected the flashlight's glow like tiny stars trapped in the rock. He ran a calloused hand across the surface and felt the unnaturally even texture, utterly unlike anything he'd encountered in decades of working with natural stone on the farm. At first, the space seemed to be a simple rectangular chamber. But as he probed the corners with his flashlight, Oliver spotted a doorway on the far side, framed by elegantly sculpted lines. The top of the doorway was arched, its keystone adorned with intricate geometric patterns. Gently, he stepped forward, still mindful of his own breath echoing in the confined space. The hum he had sensed earlier grew slightly louder with each step. A strange notion occurred to him. It felt as if the walls themselves were somehow alive, not in a literal sense, but in the way they seemed to respond to his presence. No inscriptions that he could recognize stood out at eye level. Instead, the designs were purely geometric, nested triangles, twisting lines, something that might have been stylized ivy leaves or swirling fractal shapes. There were small niches carved into the stone here and there, each about the size of a human hand. Within these niches lay small circular plates of dull metal that seemed affixed to the rock. Cautiously, Oliver touched one, feeling a slight warmth against his fingertips before he jerked back. It was no warmer than, say, a human body, yet the sensation made his heart skip a beat. Why would metal embedded in a subterranean wall have any heat at all, especially on a cold stone surface that obviously hadn't seen sunlight in who knew how long? A gust of wind from above momentarily rustled the dust motes. Oliver remembered that he hadn't told anyone where he was going. It was typical for him not to do so. Living alone on the farm meant there were few people to inform, but now, standing in that silent chamber, he felt a pang of worry about what would happen if something went wrong. The ladder was still in place, though, and if he stayed cautious, he would be fine. Determined to press on, he passed through the arched doorway. Beyond lay a corridor that sloped gently downwards, extending farther than his flashlight could reach. The corridor was large enough for him to walk without stooping, a fact that both comforted and unnerved him. He half expected the space to be cramped like a typical root cellar or old crypt. Instead, it felt spacious, meticulously crafted. The air smelled faintly of minerals and something else, something Oliver could not immediately name, but it reminded him of the way the sky smells just before a lightning storm, a sharp tang of ozone or electricity. The deeper he went, the more he noticed subtle changes in temperature. The corridor remained cooler than the summer air outside, but not unbearably so, as though regulated by a hidden system. Every few yards, the corridor's walls were broken by carved panels displaying more geometric patterns. At times they almost appeared to shift when viewed from different angles, an optical illusion that sent shivers down his spine. His mind whirled with questions. Who built this place? How old was it? And why was it hidden beneath a barn in rural Vermont, of all places? A sudden flicker from his flashlight made him pause. He tapped the barrel, suspecting the batteries were old. Normally, he kept spares in the house, but he hadn't thought to bring extras for this unplanned excursion. The beam stabilized, though it dimmed slightly. Oliver took this as a sign that perhaps he shouldn't push too far. Yet curiosity won out. He pressed forward, hoping to catch a glimpse of what might lie at the corridor's end before returning for better supplies. He continued for another 20 or 30 steps, carefully avoiding uneven spots in the stone floor. Then he froze at a sight that defied logic. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, an almost cavernous space with a ceiling that soared high above. Massive, elegantly carved columns rose from the floor, each fluted and adorned with spiraling motifs that seemed to shift in the dancing light. A wide circle was inlaid in the center of the floor, a mosaic of shimmering black stone ringed by metallic strips that resembled copper or bronze, though neither exactly matched the color. In the middle of that circle stood what looked like a raised dais, or perhaps a platform, no taller than his knee. Oliver's mouth went dry. It was incredible. Beautiful in its alien grandeur. It felt like stepping into a forgotten temple or some advanced structure far removed from human history. He approached the mosaic circle, noticing how the metallic bands glowed faintly when his flashlight passed over them. He knelt down to examine the dais and realized it was made from the same polished granite as the walls. A small recess lay at its center, shaped like a perfect sphere had once sat there, though it was empty now. He hesitated, uncertain whether to step onto the mosaic or leave it undisturbed. That hesitation saved him from missing a soft scraping sound echoing from somewhere behind him. Spinning around, he directed his flashlight back into the corridor he'd just traversed. The beam caught nothing but stillness and dust. Yet the scraping sound had definitely been real, like stone sliding against stone in the distance. He felt a spike of adrenaline. Had the barn shifted further and caused more debris to fall in? Or was someone else down here? Cautiously, he scanned the chamber, shining the light into every corner. The emptiness of the place took on an unsettling quality, as if it were watching him. He couldn't shake the impression that these designs, these patterns and faintly glimmering metals, served a purpose beyond mere decoration. A slight tremor in the floor under his feet reminded him of the humming sensation he'd felt earlier, but now it seemed more pronounced. It was as though the entire underground structure had awakened to his presence. His gut told him to return to the surface, to get better equipment, maybe even call a local historian or an archaeologist from the nearest university. But a stronger impulse, a sense that he might never forgive himself if he turned back now, compelled him to take a few more steps around the dais. His flashlight began flickering again, more insistently this time. He cursed under his breath, giving it a few desperate taps. The corridor behind him grew darker, and the corners of the chamber seemed to close in. Then, as if in response to his pounding heart, one of the circular metallic plates on a column began to glow. At first, it was a faint luminescence, barely more than a gentle radiance. But it spread, traveling along the carved grooves in the column's surface like liquid light. Oliver stared in awe. The patterns on the walls and columns responded in kind, one after another, lighting up in successive arcs. Within moments, the entire chamber was bathed in a soft glow that emanated from the lines and shapes themselves. It was both mesmerizing and terrifying. The feeling of being inside something alive returned tenfold. Oliver called out, unsure why he expected an answer. "Hello?" His voice bounced off the polished walls, distorting in strange echoes. He heard a faraway rumble. Possibly thunder from the storm front that lingered outside, or possibly something else stirring within these hidden depths. A new problem quickly became evident. As the glow spread, the air changed, intensifying the mineral tang he had noticed earlier. A wave of vertigo hit him, and he had to steady himself against the nearest column. Looking upward, he saw that the ceiling was now partially illuminated as well, revealing swirling patterns that converged in the highest part of the dome overhead. A moment later, he sensed a gentle vibration pass through the stone beneath his boots. He decided he couldn't ignore the warning signs. Whatever this place was, it wasn't inert. Something, or someone, had designed it to react when an intruder, perhaps a visitor, stepped inside. Oliver felt severely unprepared. He needed supplies, a reliable source of light, and maybe a second pair of eyes. Leaving the chamber, he cast one last glance at the dais. Was he imagining it, or had the shape of the recess changed slightly, as though it were adjusting itself? The flashlight flickered wildly, then died altogether. Thankfully, the structure's lines and patterns still emitted a faint glow, enough for him to navigate. He retraced his steps, hastening through the corridor. The soft humming rose in pitch, and that scraping noise sounded again, louder this time. All he wanted was to climb back up the ladder to the barn and breathe fresh air. Step by step, he made his way toward the base of the ladder, using the residual glow from the walls to guide him. When he finally reached the ladder, he breathed a sigh of relief. As he placed a foot on the first rung, a sudden shock passed through his body, an electric jolt that made him yelp and nearly drop the flashlight he'd been gripping. Panicking, he jerked his foot back. The metal of the ladder seemed to be carrying a charge. In the dull glow, he saw thin arcs of light dancing across the ladder's sides. He swore under his breath, uncertain how to proceed. He tested it with his work glove on, but the shock sparked again, though less severely. Summoning his resolve, he pulled his jacket over his hands to insulate them and began climbing, grit teeth set firm, bracing for more jolts. By the time he emerged into the barn, his limbs were shaking. He scurried away from the hole and collapsed to his knees on the dusty floorboards. The barn felt suffocating in its stillness, the storm-damaged beams creaking overhead. It was a relief to see the slivers of daylight peeking through the rotted roof once more. Gasping for breath, Oliver stared at the jagged opening in the floor. An otherworldly glow still emanated from below, flickering against the edges of the boards as though the space itself was alive down there. His mind spun in frantic circles. Should he cover it up? Close it off? Or should he document everything with photos, videos, maybe call the local news or a friend with more knowledge of strange phenomena? Reason warred with fear. If this discovery became public, it could upend his life. The farm was struggling financially. There was talk of a corporation trying to buy up local farmland for commercial development. But if something of immeasurable value lay hidden beneath his land, it might solve his money problems in ways he couldn't begin to guess. He decided that covering it up, at least temporarily, was the best immediate course. If the structure below was responding to his presence, there was no telling what a sudden rainstorm or rummaging by local wildlife could do if left unchecked. Gathering a few sheets of plywood, he carefully placed them over the opening, weighing them down with concrete blocks. The strange glow under the barn floor dimmed, but it did not fully vanish. An eerie luminescence seeped through the cracks, hinting at the enigma below. Back in the house, Oliver found himself trembling. He set his flashlight on the table and tried to organize his thoughts. Could he even confide in someone about this? The nearest person he fully trusted was a longtime friend named Mason Clark, a semi-retired surveyor who lived about 10 miles away. Mason had helped Oliver's father map the property lines years ago. If anyone might believe him without jumping to conclusions, it would be Mason. But still, the idea of telling someone about what he'd seen, an impossibly advanced subterranean corridor, glowing columns, an energy that seemed to interact with human presence, felt like the stuff of science fiction. He attempted to make himself a cup of coffee but found his hands so unsteady that he nearly dropped the kettle. Heat blossomed across his cheeks as he realized he was trembling not only from fear but from exhilaration. The raw wonder of what lay beneath his barn had lodged itself in his mind. Despite the shock and the danger, Oliver felt a stir of excitement that he hadn't experienced in years. He was just an ordinary farmer, stumbling upon a secret that seemed far beyond the realm of normal human understanding. Trying to calm down, he powered on his computer. The screen flickered strangely, the fan whirring louder than usual. He frowned. Maybe the storm had caused a surge, or perhaps the lines from the power company were still unstable. Regardless, he opened up a blank document, intending to type out everything he could remember in case his memory started playing tricks on him. But the moment he began describing the dais and the glowing lines, the computer screen froze and went black. He tapped the keyboard and saw no response. A sense of déjà vu struck him, recalling how his flashlight had behaved earlier. Grumbling in frustration, he closed the laptop and reached for his phone, considering a call to Mason. But the phone's screen wouldn't light up. It was charged that morning, so the battery shouldn't be dead. Yet it refused to power on. An uneasy suspicion took root. Could that subterranean force be affecting electronics on the farm? He grabbed a small battery-powered radio from the kitchen drawer. It sputtered static but wouldn't lock onto any station, just hissing aimlessly. He tapped it against his palm a few times, but to no avail. The farmland outside had grown unnaturally still. The usual rustling of trees in the breeze, the call of birds, even the distant hum of passing vehicles along the main road, all seemed muted. Oliver recognized that same hush he'd felt underground, the sense of a presence that absorbed sound and life. Stepping out onto the porch, he scanned the property. His cattle were huddled near the fence line, oddly quiet and uneasy. One of them, an older cow, stared in the direction of the barn with wide, dark eyes, as though it sensed something it couldn't comprehend. Uncertain how long the effects on electronics would last, or if they were permanent, Oliver decided that waiting around in isolation was not the best plan. He needed to speak to Mason in person. The local roads weren't too bad this time of year, so he quickly scribbled a note in case anyone wandered onto the property, gone for supplies. Do not enter barn. Very unstable. Oh, Harding. He left it tacked to the door in bold lettering, then hopped into his ancient pickup truck. The engine coughed to life, which was a small mercy. Even though the phone and computer had given up, at least his old truck still functioned. It was mostly mechanical, lacking the modern electronics that so often caused problems in new vehicles. He guided the truck down the gravel driveway, glancing in the rearview mirror at the silhouette of the barn. Even from that distance, he imagined he could see a faint glow around the foundation. Maybe it was just his nerves. Regardless, the farm felt like a place forever changed. He passed through the gate, heading down the narrow country lane that wound between fields of tall grass and clusters of pine trees. Part of him wrestled with whether he was doing the right thing. A deeper part warned that whatever was happening back there was bigger than him alone. As he drove, the sky darkened further. It began to rain, softly at first, then in earnest, large drops spattering the windshield. He flicked on the wipers, squinting through the gloom. Vermont storms, he thought bitterly, always came at the worst moments. The lane twisted and turned for a few miles before joining the main paved road leading to the small cluster of houses and businesses that passed for a town. Mason's place lay just beyond, perched at the edge of a dense forest. Oliver only hoped the roads wouldn't flood before he got there. Halfway to town, the truck sputtered, headlights dimming for a moment. Oliver's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. He whispered a silent plea that it keep going. Another flicker, and the engine caught again, forging ahead. Each mile felt like a marathon until, finally, he saw the warm glow of the single traffic light in the center of Talac Springs. Four corners, a general store, a post office, and a diner, hardly a metropolis, but it was civilization. His first impulse was to stop at the general store to see if the payphone outside still worked. But the store was closed, the windows dark. A hand-painted sign on the door indicated it would open late due to an electrical issue from the storm. Shaking his head, Oliver continued through the intersection. On the far edge of the town, just beyond the last row of old Victorian houses, Mason's small home came into view, a modest structure tucked behind a stand of maples. Oliver parked the truck on the muddy driveway and sprinted through the rain to the front door, pounding on it with urgency he couldn't hide. After what felt like an eternity, Mason appeared, a tall, lanky man in his late 60s with sharp blue eyes and a thoughtful expression. His gray hair was tied back in a short ponytail. He wore a threadbare sweater and cargo pants. And his brow furrowed in concern at the sight of Oliver, soaked and shivering on his doorstep. "What in God's name happened to you?" Mason asked, stepping aside to let him in. Oliver wiped his feet hastily and entered the warm living room, where a wood-burning stove crackled. "I need your help," Oliver said, voice low and trembling. Something's happened at my farm. Under the barn." Mason's eyes narrowed, and he gestured for Oliver to sit down. "You're scaring me. Calm down. Tell me everything." Oliver began his story, starting with the storm and the damaged barn, leading up to his descent into the hidden chamber. He spoke of polished stone, glowing lines, the humming that seemed to resonate through his body. He described how the electronics failed, including his phone and computer. Mason listened intently, face devoid of skepticism but filled with concern. When Oliver finished, the older man exhaled slowly. "Well," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I can't say I've ever heard of anything like that. But you've never been one to make up wild tales. Let me get my boots. We'll go back to your place right now." The sincerity in Mason's voice was a balm to Oliver's frayed nerves. He felt a flicker of hope. Maybe with Mason's surveying equipment and knowledge of geological formations, they could make sense of this. Maybe there was a logical explanation, an unknown natural phenomenon or an old Native American site. Still, Oliver couldn't ignore the memory of those glowing columns and the metallic plates pulsing with energy. He was certain logic alone wouldn't fully account for what he'd seen. Mason fetched a duffel bag that rattled with tools. "We'll need flashlights, extra batteries, rope, and maybe my old camera. It's a film camera, so it shouldn't rely on fancy electronics. Let's see if we can document any of this. If your phone and computer are out, that might be a sign whatever's down there disrupts modern electronics. Film might stand a better chance." Oliver nodded gratefully, and within minutes they were back in the truck, heading into the driving rain. The darkness outside was almost absolute, the watery glare of the headlights revealing little more than sheets of rain. The roads were becoming treacherous, small rivulets forming in the tire ruts. Once they left the paved highway for the gravel farm lane, the going got worse, the truck's tires occasionally slipping. Yet Mason seemed calm, as if reassured by the knowledge that they were doing what needed to be done. At last, the headlights found the old Harding barn, its silhouette looming stark against the lightning-streaked sky. The structure was still leaning precariously, and Oliver parked the truck a safe distance away, not wanting the weight of the vehicle to stress the barn's already compromised foundation. Rain pummeled them as they gathered their gear. Mason raised an umbrella, which was quickly rendered useless by the swirling gusts of wind. They approached the barn entrance, water dripping from the sagging roof. With a grunt, Oliver pushed open the door. The interior was just as he'd left it, though a few puddles had formed. A faint glow still bled through the edges of the plywood sheets covering the hole in the floor, sending ghostly outlines across the walls. Mason stared in disbelief. "God Almighty," he murmured. "You weren't joking." Oliver handed him a crowbar, and together they lifted the weighted plywood off the hole. Immediately, the glow intensified, and the same humming sensation began to vibrate through the air. Mason's face tightened with a mixture of wonder and caution. They peered down into the opening. The ladder was still there, crackling faintly with tiny arcs of light, just as Oliver had experienced before. Mason pulled on a pair of heavy rubber gloves. "I'll go first," he said, his voice steady. "If there's still a charge, maybe these gloves will protect me." Oliver started to protest but saw the determination in Mason's eyes. Carefully, the older man descended the ladder, wincing as static pops danced over the rungs. Once he was safely on the stone floor, he called up, "Bring the supplies, but don't rush. I can feel the electricity. But it's not too strong with these gloves." Oliver followed, gripping the ladder with gloved hands. The atmosphere below felt even more charged than earlier. The walls pulsated with slow waves of luminescence, and the corridor that led to the large chamber flickered at intervals. Mason clicked on his film camera's flashlight attachment, aiming it at the polished walls, exhaling in amazement at the refined craftsmanship. They stood for a moment, side by side, taking in the labyrinthine patterns etched into the rock. Mason whispered, "This is no local construction, that's for sure. No colonial-era farmer built this. The stone is too finely worked, the patterns too precise. It's almost mechanical." Oliver could only nod, his heart pounding. The hum in the air felt stronger, and with two people standing there, it seemed the structure was reacting even more. The glow in the corridor pulsed in a slow, rhythmic pattern, like a heartbeat. Mason knelt, examining one of the embedded metallic plates in a wall recess. He tapped it gently with a small hammer. The plate reverberated like a bell. Almost immediately, lines of light radiated outward from that point, chasing each other down the corridor. Mason jumped back in alarm, nearly dropping his hammer. "Definitely reactive," he said, eyebrows furrowed. "My guess is some kind of energy distribution system. But how, or for what purpose?" Oliver shrugged. Words felt inadequate. Every second in that corridor made him more certain this place wasn't just old or rare, it was beyond anything in normal human experience. He motioned toward the chamber. "It opens up just a bit further in," he said quietly. With cautious steps, they made their way down the gently sloping corridor. The same swirling patterns accompanied them, occasionally shimmering as if responding to their presence. The short hair on the back of Oliver's neck stood upright, and judging by Mason's expression, he felt it too. The air crackled with potential energy. At last, the corridor opened into the vast chamber, and Mason let out an audible gasp at the sight of the soaring ceiling, the fluted columns, and the mosaic circle in the center of the floor. The dais waited there, as if beckoning them closer. "This is astonishing," Mason whispered, voice trembling with awe. "In all my years of surveying, I've never encountered anything even remotely like this. It's otherworldly." Oliver nodded, stepping carefully onto the edge of the mosaic circle. The dais looked the same as before, though the recess at its center appeared to pulse with a gentle inner light, an effect he didn't recall noticing earlier. The columns, too, glowed faintly, as though luminous veins ran beneath their surfaces. The entire chamber felt alive, humming in a low, resonant frequency that tugged at the pit of his stomach. Mason knelt by the circle's edge, retrieving a tape measure from his bag. He extended it toward the recess, studying it under the camera's light. "It's about 6 inches deep, spherical in shape," he said, furrowing his brow. "Any idea what it might have contained?" Oliver shook his head. "I thought maybe a crystal ball, or some orb, who knows. Nothing was there when I first arrived." Mason carefully inched closer, shining the light directly into the recess. The glow intensified slightly, as if reacting to the attention. A sudden, faint clicking sound reverberated through the chamber, making both men freeze. Oliver swung his flashlight beam around the perimeter, expecting to see movement, but the walls were empty, at least to the naked eye. A subtle shift caught Mason's eye. "Look, one of the columns," he said, pointing. The geometry of the patterns carved into it seemed to be rearranging themselves. The lines shifted, forming new shapes and pathways of luminescent color. They both watched in stunned silence as the column's designs reconfigured, eventually stabilizing into a symmetrical pattern that resembled a stylized tree or branching circuit. Before they could discuss it, the corridor behind them flashed with a brighter light, accompanied by a deep, resonant tone. Oliver spun around, heart hammering. The path they had just traversed looked different. Where once there had been flat walls, new recesses had appeared, each containing metallic plates that glowed in sequence. It was as if the structure was reconfiguring itself moment by moment in response to their presence. Mason's breath hitched. It's almost like it's reading us. Adapting to us. I don't know how else to describe it. Suddenly, the gentle hum crescendoed, becoming a low roar that vibrated through every nerve in Oliver's body. Mason clamped his hands over his ears, wincing in pain. The dais flared with a column of pale light that shot upward, meeting the ceiling in a crackling burst. Sparks of energy swirled in a vortex around the chamber, making the men stagger backward. The swirling patterns on the walls lit up as though a flood of power was racing through them. A choking sense of magnetism weighed down Oliver's limbs, making each movement a monumental effort. In the chaos, he saw Mason struggling to remain upright, the older man's camera slipping from his hands. The storm of light and sound in the room built to a fever pitch, then abruptly ceased, plunging the chamber into near darkness. Residual glows pulsed faintly along the columns, but the main burst of energy had vanished as quickly as it appeared. Oliver panted, sweat streaming down his face. "Are you all right?" he managed, reaching for Mason. Mason nodded shakily, retrieving his camera from the floor. The lens was cracked. "I'm fine, but we need to be careful. This place could kill us if we don't figure out how it works." A sudden flicker near the dais drew their attention. An ethereal shape shimmered over the recess, fleeting as a mirage. Oliver's mouth went dry. It almost resembled the silhouette of a tall figure, but it dissolved before he could make out details. Mason saw it too, his eyes going wide. For a heartbeat, they both wondered if they'd actually witnessed some sort of apparition, or if it was just a trick of the swirling energy. Then the floor trembled. A low, grinding quake coursed through the chamber, and Oliver realized with dread that the entire structure might be shifting again. Fear clutched his chest. If corridors were rearranging themselves, there was a possibility they could be trapped. Without a word, both men rushed to the corridor, ignoring the searing pulses of energy that danced across the walls. Sure enough, the one straight path now curved slightly, forcing them to rely on the faint luminescence to see. "We should get out while we can," Mason gasped, leaning heavily against the polished wall. Oliver nodded, heart pounding. They scrambled down the corridor, following the feeble glow. At times, the walls seemed to warp, illusions of swirling patterns misleading their eyes. More than once, Oliver had to pause, certain a segment of wall had closed off. But each time, a few more steps revealed it was just a trick of the flickering lights. When they emerged into the small chamber near the ladder, the humming receded enough for them to hear their own breathing. The ladder still sparked with intermittent electrical discharges, but they had no choice. Mason went first, carefully climbing until he reached the barn's floor. Oliver followed, wincing at every jolt that coursed through the metal rungs. They collapsed onto the barn's warped boards, lungs heaving. The storm outside had intensified, thunder echoing across the valley. Water dripped through the barn's dilapidated roof, and the whole place smelled of wet hay and raw fear. As they caught their breath, Oliver noticed that the glow beneath the barn floor had dulled significantly, flickering in and out like a dying fire. Mason spoke first, voice strained, "We need a plan. This can't stay hidden forever, not with it acting like this. The energy down there could be dangerous. I don't even know if covering it back up will make a difference." Oliver nodded, still shaken. We also can't just invite the whole world in. If the government or big corporations catch wind of this, they'll tear the place apart. My family's farm would never be ours again. A long silence passed. Lightning lit the barn's interior in a harsh flash. Mason stared at the hole, eyes dark with worry. We could barricade it better, maybe put up a warning about structural instability, keep people out while we figure out what to do. But we'll need help eventually, scientific, maybe even an engineer or two. But I agree, we can't just give this up to the highest bidder. Oliver's mind reeled with memories of that swirling energy, the adaptive nature of the walls, and the fleeting silhouette that seemed to appear in the chamber. The notion that someone or something might dwell down there, waiting for contact, gnawed at him. As bizarre as it sounded, he couldn't shake the feeling that the site was more than a mere relic, it was functional. Rain hammered the barn roof, forcing them to speak up to be heard. Despite the immediate danger and uncertainty, Oliver found himself thinking about the farm's financial struggles, about how close he'd come to selling to a development company. He thought about the handful of neighbors who still stuck around, trying to make a life in the shadow of corporate buyouts. For decades, the Hardings had prided themselves on self-reliance. Now it seemed, ironically, that the most extraordinary resource imaginable was right under their feet. The question was how to handle it without losing everything. Mason picked up his duffel bag, rummaging through it until he found a bundle of rope and a heavy tarpaulin. We can at least secure the opening for tonight. Tomorrow, we gather more resources, maybe some specialized gear. If your electronics are fried, we can see if mine work back at home. I've got an older generator that might help us bypass the interference. Then we can record data the old-fashioned way. Oliver rose, forcing his exhausted body to cooperate. The adrenaline that had fueled him was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep fatigue. Together, they laid the tarp over the hole, fastening it to the barn's frame with thick nails and overlapping sheets of plywood. The glow beneath was still visible in small slivers, but it was subdued. Oliver silently hoped that whatever mechanism below needed to rest, just as he did. When they finished, Mason gently placed a hand on Oliver's shoulder. "I'll stay the night, if you don't mind," he offered. "Feels wrong to leave you alone with that thing active down there." Oliver's relief was tangible. "I appreciate it. Let's get back to the house. I'm soaked through." They trudged through the muddy yard, battered by wind and rain, until they reached the farmhouse. The interior was dark and chilly, the power still out. Mason found some candles, and Oliver lit a fire in the old stone hearth. The flickering flame cast dancing shadows across the living room walls. They shed their wet clothes and wrapped themselves in blankets, exhaustion settling over them like a weight. In the stillness, Mason finally spoke. "Whatever's under that barn, it's older than anything we know. I can't guess how or why it works the way it does, but it's definitely responding to us. Maybe it's some kind of advanced technology from a lost civilization, or maybe something else entirely. Either way, we need to be prepared." Oliver nodded, his eyes flickering to the window, where sheets of rain distorted the view of the night outside. "I can't believe this is happening here, on my family's land." Mason sighed. "Sometimes, these things happen in the most unassuming places. If I've learned anything in my years of surveying, it's that the earth hides more secrets than we can fathom." The candles flickered. Thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing across Tallack Ridge. As tired as Oliver was, he doubted sleep would come easily. His mind overflowed with images of shimmering corridors, glowing columns, a dais that pulsed with an otherworldly light. With Mason there, he felt safer, but the enormity of the secret beneath their feet loomed in his thoughts. He couldn't help but recall the fleeting apparition they'd glimpsed, a shape that might have been watching. The question that haunted him most was simple yet profound: if the structure had a consciousness or a sentinel, what did it want from them? And what would happen if they dared to explore deeper? Outside, the storm raged on, drawing a curtain of water around the farmhouse. Within that cocoon of darkness and uncertainty, Oliver and Mason prepared themselves for whatever the next day would bring. Despite the fear, a growing spark of determination flickered in Oliver's heart. For better or worse, the discovery beneath the barn belonged to him, to his family, and to anyone who sought to preserve and understand the mysteries of their shared world.